You're listening to the Good Food CFO podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Delevan, and today we're diving into the topic of Thrive Market, a retail partner on the top of many good food founders' dream partner list. But I'm asking the question, do they really bring margins that are better than working with a partner like KeHE? Let's get to it. Before we dive into the meat of this episode, I want to take a moment to say that I am so glad to be back. The podcast went on hiatus in December for all of you and November for us here behind the scenes while I was dealing with a personal family thing. Chelsea and I go into details about that in a members only episode that aired in December. For our current or any new members, you can check that episode out in full inside the membership. I have missed being here so much and am in reflecting on why this podcast came into existence in the first place. That's the exact same reason that the podcast is back now. I remember back pre-pandemic in 2020, thinking that I really wanted to get behind a microphone to have conversations out loud with as many of you as possible that I was having one-on-one with founders, either multiple times, or that just felt so important that I wanted more people to hear them. And over the hiatus, particularly January and February, things were coming across my desk. Conversations were being had. Frustrating things were showing up, in relation to the industry that I wanted all of you to know about. And the newsletter didn't feel like the right place. I'm a much better talker than I am writer. And the idea of all of you reading through a very long newsletter that digs into this topic with nuance and context like I like to provide in our podcast just didn't seem reasonable. And social media was just a bit too tight on its time constraints for me to feel like I was doing justice to the topics that I wanted to cover. What ended up happening was that I didn't have an outlet for what I wanted to say, and frustration started to build. I kept thinking to myself, how can I do this without Chelsea? When the podcast went on hiatus and other changes were happening behind the scenes at the Good Food CFO, Chelsea's last day was in December. We also go into detail about her last days in the members only episode. But without Chelsea, or any podcast producer or editor for that matter, how could this podcast be a reality? And the decision that I made was, we're just going to do it. It's going to be a bit more lo-fi. There's going to be less editing. There's going to be more ums and uhs and silent space. And I think that that's okay. There's also going to be less consistency with when the episodes come out. I know that I can't be held to a specific cadence because I am still working with a full fractional CFO client list, and we're still building out new pieces of the Good Food CFO software every single month and growing our audience and list of users there. So this podcast is not something that I have the ability and the finances to make a very consistent, scheduled thing. It takes a big investment of finances and time to make that happen. But what it can be is me feeling inspired or feeling called to plug in the microphone, plug in the camera, and sit here and talk to all of you. And it can be that when I have something of value to share with you, I do. And we record it, we minimally edit it, and we put it out to all of you to listen to. And I think that, and I feel very strongly that the value of the content is enough to reach all of you and have you coming back for more episodes when they are released. And that might change over time, right? As things evolve and change. But that's the approach that I'll be taking right now. I will dearly miss having a human person to talk to during every episode, but there's also freedom in, like I said, just being able to come here and talk about what is on my mind. Another change that you may notice is that our most episodes will be split into free and paid content. This is as a big thank you to our members, especially those of you who stayed as members while the podcast was on hiatus, because your membership funds are a direct contribution to being able to produce this episode. It pays for the platforms we use, the technology we use to make every single episode. Without an editor and without a producer, the amount of money that is spent on every episode goes down, but it's never zero. And I thank you all so much for continuing to contribute to this podcast to make it possible in its current iteration. And for that, we want to be sure to do deep dives into financial information and provide additional insights for all of you, while also providing really helpful and valuable content for those of you taking in the free content, because that's a core part of our mission here at the Good Food CFO, which is to democratize financial information and tools, right? And make them accessible to as many people as possible. I think those are all of the updates for the day. And so without further ado, I want to get into the main topic, which is Thrive Market. And you may have surmised that if I'm asking the question, does Thrive Market really bring better margins than a distributor like KeHE, that I must have come across some interesting information. And that is true. A couple of months ago, I was monitoring the AP inbox, the accounts payable inbox for one of my clients, and began to discover some interesting emails from Thrive Market that caused me to dig a little bit deeper and do some learnings. Now, I had no reason to believe that Thrive Market was anything other than a high margin retail partner for good food brands, because that is what I had heard in the industry. And I had never had a client that worked with Thrive directly. So I didn't have any one-on-one insights into the numbers and the margins and all of that good stuff. The general consensus is that when you have a direct relationship with a retailer, you have higher margins, right? There are less middlemen between you and your final customer. When you're selling direct to retail, you can sell at a higher price point. Your margins are higher. And the client of mine who is selling into Thrive Market believed that to be true as well. And a little bit of backstory here is that whenever a client is thinking about onboarding with a new retailer, we go through a process of calculating this potential customer's profitability. So we're looking at what are the free fills or the slotting fees or the intro allowance? How many times a year do they want to go on promo? What percentage or dollar off are they expecting during each promo? Are there going to be any ads that we have to pay for? Any additional fees that are associated with working with this retailer? And we run the numbers to determine the profitability of the first 90 days, the first year, and then the second and third year usually as well. We want to understand, does this relationship have the potential to be profitable? And how many units do we need to sell to break even and become profitable, not only in year one, but in years 2 and 3 as well? This is how we determine if a retailer is a heck yes or a no, or we need to go back to the negotiating table and figure out a way that we can work together. We did not do this exercise for Thrive Market, and there's no shade to the founder or the broker for this, because we had done the work of running the numbers for direct to retail relationships. We have a threshold for margins and what is a yes for us. And so it felt like an easy yes to work with Thrive Market based on the work we had already done. It wasn't until January when I started to see payment invoices of $0 hitting our finance inbox, and then some emails with 10% and 2% allowances hitting the inbox. Now, again, I had not seen a Thrive Market contract. We had not run any of the numbers. So in reaching out to the founder, I was wanting to make sure that everything I was seeing was accurate. Were there a certain, number of products or a certain number of invoices that shouldn't be paid? Was there some sort of time frame in which, we wouldn't receive payment? Just basically, what did I need to know to make sure that everything was on the up and up with this new partner? And that's where I learned about the $4,000 free fill and what are called the damage allowance and base accrual allowance. If you're thinking about working with Thrive Market, pay attention. So now a free fill is a pretty common thing in the industry. And what it means is that a brand is going to send product up front that the retailer is not going to pay for. So in this case, the brand was sending $4,000 worth of product that Thrive Market was not going to pay for. Once that 4,000th, dollar of product was sent, then the invoices would start being paid for after that. This is different than a slotting fee in that with a free fill, the brand is sending free product and then Thrive Market is selling that at their typical retail price, right? So they're getting the full margin and the brand isn't being paid anything on what they believed would be the first $4,000 worth of products sent to Thrive Market. And I say what they believe because there's more to that story in just a second. In addition to the $0 invoices that were now explained, right? We have a $4,000 free fill. I was also seeing a 2% damage allowance and a 10% allowance on every single invoice that was sent to Thrive Market. And the founder didn't remember the specifics of what these allowances were. So they put me in touch with the broker who then sent along information from Thrive Market's emails and documentation. Here is what that said. The 10% allowance is called a base accrual allowance. And according to Thrive Market, it covers their competitive pricing efforts, new item setup fees, internal investments in shopping experience technology, and access to their brand insights dashboard for the brand. Now, a lot of people think, well, the free fill covers the new item setup fees. And so that's a great way or an easy way to sort of explain the value or the okayness of having to pay a free fill. The retailer has work to do to get that product set up in their system. But now we find out with Thrive Market that there's also a 10% allowance being applied to every single product that's also going to help cover any new item setup fees. And this allowance applies for the life of the relationship. The 2% is a damage allowance, which covers costs associated with damaged product, member returns, and expiration or spoilage. Thrive's member services team handles all member communications for returns and refunds. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out here, and this is common for many retailers, is that they do everything for the consumer, right? For Thrive, their consumer pays a membership fee. And that membership fee, which I believe is annual, gives customers access to these discounted, better for you brands. They're also charging the brand 10%, or at least a portion of that 10%, in order to be able to offer their products at a competitive price on their website. The 2% damage allowance is for member returns, right? Which they don't want members to have to pay for or take care of. And their team is doing all of the coordination and handling. So they want to charge a fee, right, to the brand for that. And just like with all distributor and many retail relationships, a damage allowance has nothing to do with the actual amount of damages or spoiled product that occur. It is an allowance that makes an assumption that there's going to be a certain amount of product that's not sellable. And so we're just going to take this 2% off of every invoice to cover that assumption, right, on spoiled goods. Now, this started to bother me I think because I believed, like so many of you do or did, that Thrive Market was a direct retailer relationship. I assumed it would be very cut and dry. This is how much we're paying for your product. This is how much, you'll send the invoice for, easy peasy. But instead, we find ourselves with every single invoice we're sending to Thrive Market getting a credit memo for essentially 12% off of the total invoice price. Why on earth can we just not make this easy? And I started to get a little cynical here, which I think I have a right to after this many years in the industry. And I started to wonder if this 12% was the result of a brand quoting Thrive Market with their initial price, right? Their initial direct to retail price. And then Thrive Market coming back and saying, that's great, but we're also going to charge a 10% and a 2% allowance. And the brands are more likely to agree to that than a lower price on the product itself. At this point in time, this was a hypothetical. I wasn't sure of how the contract went down or how the relationship had evolved and what came first. But it was frustrating. And what was confusing to me also at the time was why this 10% allowance and 2% allowance were being applied to invoices that were also inclusive of the free fill. I ran the numbers, and essentially the brand would be sending not $4,000, but closer to $5,000 worth of product for free to Thrive Market. And then I started to get curious about the numbers, because if the brand believed that Thrive Market was going to pay our stated direct to retail price, but they were actually reducing that price by 12%, what was the margin that the brand was actually hitting in this Thrive Market relationship? And out of curiosity, based on what I know about their other partners, how much better were Thrive Market's margins than KeHE? So I started to do the math. And when I calculated the actual price that Thrive was paying after the 12% in allowances, the difference between Thrive and KeHE was just $1 per unit, meaning Thrive Market was paying $1 more per unit than KeHE was to this brand. Now, this does not include additional promotions, any other kinds of credits that might apply, or the free fill. I was just looking at the straight prices, essentially, that each of this distributor and retailer were paying. With KeHE, I knew that the price that we quoted them included any like shipping costs and stuff like that, but I wasn't sure about that for Thrive Market. So I followed up with the founder and asked who was paying for shipping. And the answer was the brand. The brand was shipping to multiple Thrive Market locations. And for each of those, the brand was paying for the shipping. So we ran the numbers on the last, I think it was 6 shipments. So at least 1, if not 2, to each of the locations that the brand was shipping to. And when we did that math, the margins to the brand from Thrive Market were now lower than KeHE's. I was stunned. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it, actually. And again, like I was factoring in KeHE's 2% spoilage that is standard, right? I was taking the shipping into consideration. Thrive Market's 10%. So I was trying to do this like literally as evenly as possible, apples to apples comparison. I was so surprised and honestly not excited, but happy that these numbers had come across my desk, because this is the kind of information that founders need to know. This is why, even when a relationship is direct to a retailer, doing the math, understanding the full finances of a relationship are so incredibly important. because there are other costs associated with working with Thrive that I will dive into later on in this episode that are going to further reduce the margins of this relationship, just like there are with Kehi. But the bottom line here is that the expectation of a Thrive Market relationship is that the brand will make more money, that it will be a higher margin relationship. And I had just learned that that is not true, which then made me curious about if it would sometimes be true or never be true. And so before releasing this podcast episode, I wanted to talk to some other founders who had worked with Thrive Market. Here is what I found. Every founder that I spoke to is having the 10% base allowance and 2% spoils allowance applied to every invoice that they send to Thrive Market. The $4,000 free fill amount is not something that is consistent across all brands. Here are some other things we've learned about Thrive Market. In some cases, they want Thrive Market specific packaging or unit sizes. So there was one founder that I talked to that made a custom package size for a Thrive Market. And in that instance, there was no free fill, which makes sense, right? You're literally making product that's custom to Thrive Market. So them waiving that free fill makes sense. There were other brands, other founders that I spoke to who also had the $4,000 free fill waived. And they did not say that it would have been $4,000, but in lieu of running specific marketing and promotional campaigns with Thrive Market from day one. So there is an ability to negotiate, and it probably has to do with, what Thrive understands their customers will want, how badly they want you, on their website, just like with any other retailer, right? Everything seems to be negotiable except for, and please write in hello@thegoodfoodcfo.com if you aren't paying a 10% base allowance and 2% spoilage allowance to Thrive Market. But that does seem to be, in the little bit of research that I was able to do, a consistent thing. The other thing that does seem consistent across the board is that when Thrive Market asks for pricing, each of the founders sent their direct to retail price, believing initially that that would be the price that Thrive Market would pay to them. Upon receiving that information is when Thrive Market emails back, in the cases that I'm speaking about, to say, okay, there will also be a 10% allowance and a 2% allowance, and then any other associated things like the free fill, et cetera, et cetera. One of the founders that I talked to, when I said, what are your margins with Thrive Market? They stated their direct to retail margins. And I said, is that before or after the 12%? They said before. And then they added in, or subtracted, I should say, that 12% from the price that Thrive is paying, and realized what their margins from Thrive Market actually are. I cannot be clear enough here to say that this episode is not about not working with Thrive Market. As I said at the top of the episode, Thrive is a retail partner that is at the top of many good food founders' dream partner lists. Your consumer is on the other side of Thrive Market's website. The point of this conversation is to expose the incredible importance of always running the numbers before you say yes, and never make an assumption that a direct to retail relationship is going to have better margins than working with a distributor like Kehi. Of course, every brand's numbers are different and unique. Your margins are different and unique, but that doesn't take away the importance of running the numbers. I think the other thing that's really true with founders, as I talk to more and more of you, is that when you see 10% and 2%, it doesn't seem like it could possibly add up to a number that would have a significant impact on your gross margins or your bottom line. But when we actually do the math and look at it, it is more significant than you thought. So that's the story of how I discovered what the margins can really look like for a brand selling through Thrive Market. Inside the membership portion of this podcast, I'm going to do a deeper dive, sharing additional marketing and other fees that Thrive Market may apply to a brand relationship. I'll be sharing on screen the side-by-side cost comparison for Thrive Market and KeHE so you can see the numbers yourself. And I'm going to be walking through the exact questions that you should ask before signing with any retailer or distributor, my contract red flags to watch out for, and how to protect your margins before you commit to a new partnership. If you're not yet a member, you can join us by visiting thegoodfoodcfo.com or via the link in the show notes. Monthly and annual memberships are available, with annual members getting additional benefits, including discounts on our financial strategy software and a free financial audit done by me. I'll see you inside, or I'll see you in the next episode.